cloud. Okay. And why don't we start with a bracha? So I need to share my screen and hopefully find my bracha. All right, can you all see that?
Really? Oh.
The thermostat, sure.
Okay,
We just paid 350.
hopefully we can all see that together. Let's say the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu la'asok b'vrei Torah.
Amen.
Okay. So I have no idea how long today is going to run. I think it's going to be maybe about an hour. It might be a little bit over. If anybody has a hard stop at 7:30 and needs to go, fine. We may need a little extra 10 minutes, maybe not. So let me start with an opening question. What positive lesson have you learned from a hardship in your life? Yes, Annette. And if everyone who's not speaking could please go on mute, we'll this way get rid of the background noise.
Well, I have to keep relearning this lesson, sadly. But since we're sort of talking about mourning and death, and I've been learning this lesson since I was a child, every time someone I love dies, I learned that life is short, not to sweat the small stuff, to focus on the important things. And then somehow I forget that. And the next time someone I love dies, I learn it all over again. As I've gotten older, the time period that I held on to that has expanded. But I wish it would just stay with me. Every minute of every day.
Thank you for sharing that, Annette. That's very kind of a poignant, and that constant tug, right, between learning that lesson and forgetting that lesson and kind of hearing it again. I think we all experienced that. Beautifully stated. Thank you. Nami.
Because of what Annette said, there's a book by T.S. Eliot who basically wrote in verse, and some people object. There are very few people. Our own rabbi has quoted T.S. Eliot, even though he was an admitted anti-Semite. Okay, so he admitted it, actually went to a seminar about him being an anti-Semite and said it was all true. So I think that's a lesson that he learned, to tell the truth about himself. But he wrote one book called The Four Quartets, which is, to me, one of the best. I'm not necessarily a poetry reader, but it's not rhyming. It's in 4 sections. That's why it's called Four Quartets. I think it's a masterpiece. I really do. And I have found that with every major loss I have had, when someone has passed away, I have gone running to the Four Quartets. And there's one line in it that I'm walking down the street, I run into him, some person, first person singular, runs into someone else. And he says to the first person singular, the narrator, this other man says to him, with a shrouded sort of appearance, sort of like a Dr. Sachs, Jack Kerouac's Dr. Sachs, trench coat hat. You can't see his face. And he said, okay, I've told you this before, not in a mean way. I'm going to tell you again, and I'm going to have to tell you again. And I can relate that because I just did go through all the verses you sent out. So I can relate that to the verses, which I'll mention when that time comes. But it Four Quartets just captures that for me.
Well, thank you for that reference. I love Eliot's poetry. So I love The Wasteland and Proof Rock and all of that stuff. So thank you for pointing us to that and the coming back to something again and again. Thank you.
Well, the whole theme of the Four Quartets is in the beginning is the end, and in the end is the beginning.
Right, very apt.
It's very Deuteronomy,
Yeah.
very Devarim.
Anyone else have thoughts on this question? Okay, well, let's go into some text and some learning. Let's see, I think I may need to, I'm not sharing anything, right? You guys are just seeing each other, right? Good. All right, so first thing I'd like to do is situate us in the annual calendar. So we are in a 3-week period of intensifying mourning that started with a fast that occurred on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. And that culminates on the fast of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, which follows Tammuz. And this year that falls on August 7th. So we're, maybe about halfway through that 3-week mourning period. Tisha B'Av was designated by the rabbis as a day of deep national mourning. The Talmud lists a series of calamities that occurred to the Jewish people on Tisha B'Av, and it's quite a list. So the Mishnah discusses and lists 5 things. On the 9th of Av, it was decreed upon our ancestors that they would all die in the wilderness and not enter the land of Israel. The temple was destroyed for the first time in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, and a second time by the Romans. The city of Beitar was captured, and the city of Jerusalem was plowed under as a sign that it would never be rebuilt. So already in the time of the Mishnah, call it 200 AD, there was this tradition extending back to the whole incident of the spies, the scouts, that bad things happened on Tisha B'Av. Now, historically, I don't know if it's true. I've read it over and over and over again. In addition to this list of 5 from the Talmud, the Jews were expelled from England in 1290. These are all on Tisha B'Av. The Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. And Germany declared war on Russia in World War I, which you can, if you sort of do the historical marker to Germany's humiliation in World War I, tie that to the Holocaust in World War II. So maybe a little bit attenuated, but the 9th day of Av is not a good day. Now, in addition, Tisha B'Av itself is the beginning of this 7-week period that ends with Rosh Hashanah. So there are exactly 7 weeks between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Hashanah is the gateway to the 10 days of awe that end with Yom Kippur. And those are followed by the joy and renewal of Sukkot. So Tisha B'Av, which is coming up, kicks off this annual penitential journey. It starts with the waning of the solar cycle, with the hints of winter, to come, and the issues of our mortality and reckoning with our mortality that Annette was very expressly talking about at the beginning. In the annual Torah cycle, we conclude Bamidbar, the book of the wilderness, this coming week. And then the Torah portion for next week, which is always paired with Tisha B'Av, is the opening of the book of Devarim, which Naomi was reminding us is a recapitulation. And that's a set of speeches delivered by Moses to the children of Israel as they ready themselves to enter the promised land. Devarim recaps the journey from Egypt through the desert, and that recap begins with Moses's telling of the incident of the spies. So that's the first of the tragedies that Tisha B'Av cites in the Talmud, right? Recited about Tisha B'Av in the Talmud. So it often happens that the Torah reading may not be exactly where the holiday calendar is, but it will rhyme with the holiday calendar. And we have that very much here because we're going to be talking about that incident of the spies. So the first thing, let me see if I can manage this here. I'm going to close this off. I am going to share, and I am hopefully going to find, let's see, hold on one second. I need to pull this up. Give me one sec. No, that's not it. Hold on. There we go. Let me try this. And there we go. All right. So the section is the first telling of the incident of the spies, and it's talking about God's response to the people accepting the spies' report about how the land is full of giants and they're not going to be able to conquer it. And God is extremely angry. The section here that I have in screen share is from Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 14, 26 through 33. And would anyone like to read that?
Rich, do you have a background on it? Can you hear it?
You know what? You have some background noise, Stephanie, so if you don't mind muting. Thank you. I think maybe I'll ask someone to read just to keep the flow going. Annette, would you mind reading, starting with 26?
Adonai spoke further to Moses and Aaron. Wait, how much longer shall that wicked community keep muttering against me? Very well, I have heeded the incessant muttering of the Israelites against me. Say to them, as I live, says Adonai, I will do to you just as you have urged me. In this very wilderness shall your carcasses drop. Of all of you who were recorded in their various lists from the age of 20 years up, you who have muttered against me, not one shall enter the land in which I swore to settle you, save Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. Your children, who you said would be carried off, these will I allow to enter, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But your carcasses shall drop in this wilderness, while your children roam the wilderness for 40 years, suffering for your faithlessness, until the last of your carcasses is down in the wilderness.
Okay, thank you. So what's your reaction to that section? Yeah, go ahead, Annette.
Well, this is one of the portrayals of God that I hate in the Torah, because there's no, I understand that the people are complaining and they're whining and blah, 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 blah. But there's no empathy, there's no nothing. The language is harsh. The punishment is harsh. This is not a God that I want to worship.
Yeah, I hear
And
you.
a lot of times when I say that, rabbis get very incensed. Almost all the time when I say that, rabbis get incensed.
You know what? It is a harsh passage. And I think one of the hard parts of the Torah is when you hit one of these harsh passages that has no compassion for people who had spent hundreds of years in slavery. You know, the answer is they're not ready. They're not ready to go in. And if they're not ready to go in, that's not something to beat them up about. It's something to, you know, have some compassion for. And it's like, you're not going to see it, but at least your kids will. So I totally agree with you.
It's not just that you're not going to see it. It's, you know, I'm going to drop your carcasses and to hell with you and whatever. It's really, the imagery is hateful.
Oh, I totally. Fallon.
Although maybe not as harsh, it also inflicts punishment on the generation to come, because it says they will wander for 40 years until all of you are dead, and only then will they be allowed into the promised land. Which, like, okay, they're not also going to have to wander until all of their carcasses drop, but they're still getting penalized for something that they didn't even partake in, but also it's an incredibly harsh, like out of proportion reaction to, yeah, even if they were complaining incessantly after everything they've been through. I think the least they had the right to do was complain.
You know, it's interesting. I think it's a great point, and it makes you think about generational trauma, right? It's like it perpetuates. So I think, Ellen, I really appreciate your pointing out the fact that this was punishment visited upon the children as well. Any other reactions?
I don't know if this is going to be a popular thing to say.
Okay, fasten your seatbelts. Here we go.
I really don't. And I don't want to drag the current situation in 2022 into it. But after the last 2 weeks of June, and you're an attorney, you know what I'm talking about. There were quite a few decisions made for the future of this country, with more on the way per invitation from one of the judges. Come and get us. We're going to give you what you want. And I had been told in 2000, and many people like myself have been told in 2000 and 2016, we don't want to hear your talk about what might happen. And all I could say is, don't you realize that what you've got, you could lose everything? And can you please, please compromise? And when this did happen, the last week of June in 2022, a lot of people really lost it. I saw it with my own friend base on Facebook, social media. And the response was, how dare you lecture us? How can you talk to us this way? And it's like, but we begged you to listen. We begged you to compromise. We begged you not to, we begged you. We begged.
I'm sorry. So Nami, could you describe for us who was supposed to compromise, or and who was begging who?
The people who would not. I don't want to drag this into it, but I know that we've been told as being people who really got angry after the last 2 weeks of June in 2022 with all the decisions that came down from the Supreme Court now, which was what was predicted. I could have predicted this in 2000, and I begged people, don't do this. Don't throw your vote away. I did it in 2016.
I see.
It wasn't just me. And so many, and it was even before anyone could open their mouth and say, thanks for nothing. We begged you not to do this. That and that instead it was like, well, what about this and what about that? Instead, it was like, I felt like, forget acts of contrition. I wasn't expecting an act of contrition, but that's what I'm seeing here. I mean, it's like complain. We want more. We want it to be perfect. And well, it's certainly not perfect anymore.
Gotcha.
It's further from perfect than it's ever gonna be again, very possibly. And so when I see this, I see a God that is angry because he's saying, I tried talking to you. I tried using kind language. I brought you manna. I brought you out of across the sea of reeds. I brought you out of Miriam. All I have heard is complaint, which to the point that even Moshe hits the rock. He didn't want to hit the rock. He didn't want to disobey. But when there were people who kept their eye on what God was saying to them, because in the middle of all this, it mentions that Joshua and Caleb do get to go into the land. They're the only ones under the age of 20 that do get to go to the land, because as you pointed out, they were ready. And maybe sometimes even, I remember the rabbi at my son's bar mitzvah said, sometimes even God has bad days.
Right.
I remember that so well. I don't remember the context, but it was Hukat Balak, so it would have been about the water probably.
Right.
And so it was, I'm just trying to have some compassion to God when he has tried, she, that power has tried so hard. And
I hear you.
so
Thank you
I'm
for
sorry.
that. Thank you for that. No, framing. It's an interesting way to think about it. Let me, so Fallon, yes.
I do think that even God can have a bad day, but what results from God having a bad day versus a human having a bad day is very, very, very different in scale. It's like the more power you have, the more weight the consequences of your action carry, the more people they affect. And just this idea of being upset that things aren't getting better faster. I mean, when oppression is visited upon a people, different demographics, even within, you know, a certain group, different demographics in that group experience the oppression in very different ways. Like the experience of the woman Israelites or the people who are able to bear children would have been very different from that of the men that or those who were not able to bear children, or even those who might have looked more like the Egyptians for a variety of reasons. So even if people share a common oppression, some people within that group are going to experience even more than others. And so what may seem like unreasonable or sort of overblown complaining is because they're starting in a different place, like a place that's like further back than some of the other people are. Some who maybe didn't have it as bad. And so they hear this complaining and they're like, okay, yes, you know, we were slaves, but like, come on. It's
Right.
like, yes, we were slaves, and then we also had to deal with all of this stuff that you didn't have to. And
Interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
just being aware of like the multifaceted identities of people and understanding that not everyone's experience is going to be the same. People are going to react differently in light of that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand.
It's interesting when you think about the leadership challenge of someone in Moses's position, trying to knit together people with these different experiences and trauma. So thank you for pointing that out. I'd like to keep us moving, but Ken, I know you were waiting to say something, and then I want to move us to a mid-rush that you'll find very interesting. Go ahead.
Well, just quickly, thanks. Yeah. So an oddity that I didn't understand, that why age 20 and over? So it seemed like the 13-year-olds got bar mitzvah, presumably. I mean, they have the obligations of adulthood, but the teenagers seem to have been given a pass here, and I'm wondering if there's some meaning in that. Is this to underline the idea that this is an adult responsibility, that teenagers might get we might cut them some slack for whining once in a while, but the adults we're really going to hold accountable for this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the census was originally done for the men of fighting age, and that's what this is kind of pivoting off of. And I guess you could take it maybe a little bit to its extension that maybe the people at that age were sort of fully formed and had their sort of consciousness forged in Egypt, and maybe those younger than that. But, you know, I think it's a little bit of an arbitrary marker, so maybe we won't go too deeply into it, but I appreciate you pointing it out. But here's the thing. I do think that this notion of 600,000 people, and you know, there's some question about whether the women died along with the people, but, you're looking at, probably an equivalent number of women. So, 1.2 million, let's say anyway, dying in the wilderness over the course of 40 years. And if you do the math, it's a phenomenal number of people who are dying. And so was this constant death march? So there is an interesting midrash about this that I'm hopefully will be able to put my hands on. And this is the midrash. So hopefully you can see this in screen share. And Nancy, would you like to read this midrash? It's from the midrash around Eicha, the Book of Lamentations.
Okay. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, there were no days as joyous for Israel as the 15th of Av and as Yom Kippur, on which the daughters of Jerusalem will go out in white borrowed garments so as not to embarrass one who did not have one. Rabbi Avin and Rabbi Yochanan said, it is the day that the digging for those who died in the wilderness was halted. Rabbi Levi said, every eve of the 9th of Av, Moses would dispatch a herald to the entire camp saying, go out and dig. And they would go out and dig graves and sleep in them. In the morning, he would dispatch a herald saying, rise and separate the dead from the living. And they would stand and take themselves out. 15,000 and more were subtracted for a total of 600,000. In the 40th year, the last one, they did so and found themselves intact. They said, it appears that we were mistaken in our calculation. And they did the same on the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th. When the moon was full, they said, it appears that the Holy One, blessed be he, abrogated the decree from upon us. And they then rendered it a holiday.
So this is kind of an odd one, but the gist of it is that the 40 years in the desert were not this constant, drumbeat of death every day, but instead, annually, Moses told all of the Israelites to dig their own graves and climb into them. And then after Tisha B'Av was over, those who died, would not come out of the graves. Those who did live through it came out of their graves. It was 15,000 a year. And after 40 years, you get 600,000. And in the last year, when they finally saw that there were no more people dying, they knew the decree was over. This midrash blows my mind. And I'm just wondering what reaction people have to this notion that there was this massive grave digging every year during the 40 years. Yes, Fallon.
It's really awful, but it makes me think of another situation in which Jews were forced to dig their own graves and then died, killed in the case that I'm thinking of in the concentration camps. But that's really dark.
It's a pretty morbid association, and it feels like a dark midrash, but maybe, there's another view on it. Yes, Annette.
It makes me think about what I said at the beginning. It's like a centering and a reminder that we're all going to die. And if I dig my own grave and I survive that year, it helps centers me and makes me think for the next year what's important and what I need to focus on. And apropos of my saying that that's so easy to forget, this is an annual reminder. If I live through each year, each grave digging, about what I need to focus on every year. So you don't have to wait for someone else to die because you've gone through your own death and climbing out. And so maybe you can live a little better each year if you live through it.
I think you're exactly right. I look at it as like Unatana Tokef on steroids. right? You're not just gonna like, who's gonna die by hanging? I mean, you literally climb into your grave, and if you don't confront your own mortality, then, when else will you? So I think you're exactly right. Ken?
So yeah, a friend once, an old friend of mine had died at age 40, quite some time ago. And I remember a close friend saying, well, that one of the moment or the opportunity that death gives you, death like that, is to think about what is most important. Just as, Annette, just as you said, that is the one, that is the growth opportunity in it.
Yeah. And I want to, go back to one other thing, Annette, when you said, I get this consciousness and then I lose it, right? But another way to think about it is, rather than this steady, experience of death, it allowed people normalcy, right? So that you have your focus on this funereal moment or day, and maybe the period of mourning after that. And then you can kind of go back to some semblance of regular life, because living with that kind of intensity of consciousness that also has to come with the experience of loss is maybe itself not tenable.
Well, it also makes death part of life, which I think in this country we're very bad at.
Yeah.
We kind of separate death from life, and it's integral to life. And this provides a ritual for that.
Right.
Very intense one, but
Yes. Yes. Nomi?
This came up yesterday in terms of a book group I belong to, and we were talking about a book that involves a lot of old Scottish customs. And when a Scottish woman, maybe it's the Highlands only, I'm not sure, but when they get married, one of the first things they start to do, now it's possibly because there's such a high number of women died in childbirth back in, before modern times or whatever. As soon as they became married, they started to create and embroider their own shroud. And I found it fascinating. And there's, in the novel that we were discussing, someone did die and unexpectedly, as happens often, even more often then. And they had to go, they went and found her shroud, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was embroidered and beautiful flowers with vines. And I assume they made their new husband's shroud as well as soon as they finished theirs. And I just thought it was a very grounding, accepting of our own. We are mortal.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
I just thought it was a fascinating coincidence that this came up.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's perfect analog to digging graves, and at least you get a shroud out of it. All right. So what I wanted to do is just very quickly go to an interesting set of teachings about that moderate the mourning of Tisha B'Av, so that in fact, I grew up with a tradition of you read the Book of Lamentations, you sit on the floor and read these prayers called kinot. But actually, there's a pretty significant set of teachings with regard to some joy that's put into the holiday. You are actually commanded, and by custom, there are some moderated moments. So I'm going to share the screen here, and I'm going to read quickly one thing from the Talmud. So the sages taught in a Braita, which is a kind of an appendage to one of the teachings of the Talmud. When the temple was destroyed a second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews, whose practice was not to eat meat and not to drink wine. Rabbi Yehoshua joined them to discuss their practice. He said to them, "My children, for what reason do you not eat meat and you do not drink wine?" They said to him, "Shall we eat meat from which offerings are sacrificed upon the altar, now that the altar has ceased to exist? Shall we drink wine, which is poured as a libation upon the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist?" Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, "If so, we will not eat bread either, since the meal offerings that were offered upon the altar have ceased. They replied, "You are correct. It is possible to subsist with produce." He said to them, "We will not eat produce either, since the beginning of the first fruits have ceased." They replied, "You are correct. We will no longer eat the produce of the 7 species from which the first fruits were brought, as it is possible to subsist with other produce." He said to them, "If so, we will not drink water, since the water libation has ceased." They were silent, as they realized they could not survive without water. Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, "My children, come and I will tell you how we should act. To not mourn at all is impossible, as the decree was already issued and the temple has been destroyed. But to mourn excessively, as you are doing, is also impossible, as the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it." Another tradition from this place in the Talmud is that the Messiah is born on Tisha B'Av. So in fact, all of this destruction and the loss of the temple and everything else, the act that will restore everything, the birth of the Messiah, actually occurs on Tisha B'Av. And there's a passage from the Bible that talks about Tisha B'Av converting, in fact, to a holiday at some point of time in the future. There's a custom that you're not supposed to bathe on a fast day like this, but women were supposed to be able to wash their hair, starting with the earliest time that you could say the afternoon service. And so it's interesting that the halakha, the law, basically, and tradition, basically infuse Tisha B'Av with the sort of the means out of the destruction of the Jewish people, being the Messiah. I think the challenge for me, as someone who doesn't believe that there will be a Messiah, is to say, how do I bring this teaching into my experience of the world, and have it be something, shall I say, sort of that infuses my life with meaning. And I guess what I think about is going back to the challenging moments and focusing on the lessons that I can draw from the challenging moments, and what redemption is there within something that looks like tragedy. And basically, if you look at it long enough, there's a silver lining to almost everything. I won't say everything, but which is not to say that, if you could avoid the tragedy, you wouldn't, because obviously that's true. But at some point, the business of life is about coming to terms with the difficult stuff if you can. And Tisha B'Av, I think, implicitly sends that message by saying we can't just sit here and wallow in despair. I'd like to move us on to the second set of teachings, which relate not to national mourning, but individual mourning. And the first passage is a passage from Devarim. And Judy, would you like to read this one from Deuteronomy 14, 1-2?
You are children of your God Adonai. You shall not gash yourselves or shave the front of your heads because of the dead, for you are a people consecrated to your God Adonai. Your God Adonai chose you from among all other people on earth to be a treasured people.
Thank you. So the point of this is that the Israelites are commanded to not engage in excessive displays of mourning, and apparently some of the peoples in the Middle East at that time would, gash themselves in mourning. And obviously, as Jews, we have very specific mourning customs, but this is basically saying that mourning needs to have limits. There's a beautiful passage in the Bible about the death of Aaron, and that happens in Numbers chapter 20. And it's interesting because Numbers chapter 20 has both the death of Aaron and the death of Miriam. And I guess Stephanie, I don't know whether you've got background noise, but if it's gone, and you can read for us, 22 through 29.
I will try. Setting out from Kadesh, the Israelites arrived in a body at Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, on the boundary of the land of Edom, said to Moses and Aaron, let Aaron be gathered to his kin. He is not to enter the land that I have assigned to the Israelite people, because you disobeyed my command about the waters of Meribah. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them up on Mount Hor. Strip Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar. There Aaron shall be gathered unto the dead. Moses did as Adonai had commanded. They ascended Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. Moses stripped Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar. And Aaron died there on the summit of the mountain. When Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, the whole community knew that Aaron had breathed his last. All the house of Israel bewailed Aaron 30 days.
Thank you, Stephanie. So what's notable about that passage as we think about it? I just took it off the screen, I'm sorry, but what stays with you about that passage?
Shloshim.
Shloshim, right? So that's I think it's the origin, halachically, of the 30 days. Anything else?
Well, the whole community mourned.
The mourning of the whole community. Yes. Anything else?
He was naked,
He had to take his vestments off.
vestments off.
Yeah.
That he died the way he was born.
Interesting. Okay. So there is a little bit of a
He didn't have any of his accoutrements of what he achieved in his life.
Interesting. Okay. And related to that, those vestments go somewhere, right? To his son. So there's succession here. There's a visible, endowing of the successor by handing over the vestment. So there's a lot of ceremony here. There's collective mourning, as Ken pointed out. There's shloshim. There's, that's a pretty intense period of mourning, as Nomi is telling us. And I agree with all of that. And so that's where, to my mind, it's so interesting to go to, let me open this up, to Miriam's death, which is.
Wait, there was one more thing, Rich.
Oh, please, go ahead.
He gathered his kin. So his death, he was surrounded by his family.
Right. Okay. Thank you for pointing that out.
I haven't had the privilege of doing during COVID.
Right, right. So true, and very much part of the mourning tradition is for the family to have the shelter and comfort of each other. All right, so now let's go to earlier in that chapter, still chapter 20. We have the death of Miriam. And Ken, will you read for us chapter 20, verse 1 and 2?
1 and 2. The Israelites arrived in a body at the wilderness of Zin on the first new moon, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. The community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron.
Okay, so any reaction there to that? Yes, Val.
There's no mention of any mourning customs or practices taking place for her. And it seems like rather than be upset about the fact that she died, people are upset that they don't have the water that came from Miriam's well now. Yeah, so like they cared more about what she could do for them than the fact that she was a person.
Well, it's very quizzical, right? I mean, it's just so different than what Aaron gets, right? And it's a complete moving on. I mean, when you get to sentence number 2, it has nothing to do with the death in sentence number 1, or maybe it does, but there certainly isn't an overt connection drawn or any honoring of someone who, you know, was actually pretty significant. And you know, I gave you a bunch of passages to take a look at. And we're going to kind of knit those together. But I think that the ellipsis here, right, the absence of mourning is so striking that there's been a lot of midrash that's tried to fill in what's going on here. Yes, Ken.
Well, I thought, to me, it's kind of the opposite. I mean, my God, this is the last straw. It's like the mourning was okay, this riot. Okay, hey, we're done with this. It's like no water, no pomegranates, no dates, figs, nothing. And Miriam, it's like that was the precipitating event, was her death.
Right. Well, and I think, so let me share the screen. And I do think that, Ken, you're right. That's part of the tradition, is linking and saying that there is a connection. And so Rashi jumps in and says, since this statement about the lack of water follows immediately after the mention of Miriam's death, we may learn from it that during the entire 40 years, they had the well through Miriam's merit. So that water followed the people. And one could say that this is metaphorical and not literal, that there was something about Miriam that was provided by her presence. And that's where the Midrash starts to get really interesting. And also pondering who Miriam was, not just to the people, but to Moses. So God tells Moses, talk to the rock, bring your staff, talk to the rock, and I'll provide enough water for the people. And then in verse 10, Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock. He said to them, listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Out came copious water, and the community and their beasts drank. So what is Moses' state of mind here in 10 and 11? How would you characterize it?
It's fed up.
Fed up.
I've always thought that the juxtaposition of all of this, yeah, he's fed up, but he's in mourning for his sister.
Yes.
So I think that his anger and the reason, I've always thought that his anger and the reason he struck the rock has a lot more to do, and that's another reason I'm not so happy about God, has a lot more to do with his sister's death than
Yes.
it did about what the people were doing. And the people were kind of like the last straw, but his sister has just died. His sister, who has been with him through everything from his birth.
Yes. So can I
Yeah, go ahead.
pause that, because that I think is the heart of it. And what I'd like to do is just run through some passages and a couple of things that have been pointed out by rabbis, commentators, that really speak to exactly what you're talking about, Annette. So thank you for doing that. And if you don't mind, I'm going to pause so we can get the flow of these commentaries, which are really, some of them are really amazing and beautiful. Let me find it. Okay, so back to sharing. One thing is in the Hebrew. So in 10, Vayakilu, Moshe v'Aaron et hakal, blah, 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 v'yomer lahem shimu na hamorim hamin hasela hazen notzim lachem mayim. You will see, you rebels, whether from this rock I will be able to get water for you. Vayarem Moshe et yado, he raised his hand, vayach et hasela, he struck the rock. That word vayach appears in an earlier place of the Moses narrative when he kills the Egyptian. right? So right after Moses is raised in Pharaoh's house as his adopted son, Moshe grows up, and he went out to his kinsfolk, witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that. Vayifen ko v'cho, vayar ki ein ish. There was no one around. What's the verb? Vayach, same verb. And so this is a verbal tie that basically, this is the verb that's used for Moses when he loses it in anger. So from there, I just want to go to, to Annette's point. Who was Miriam, right? So from the beginning of the Moses narrative, it starts with a certain member of the house of Levi went and took into his household a wife, a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. We all know this story. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it, placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance. This is Miriam, to learn what would befall him. The daughter of Pharaoh came out to bathe in the Nile. While her maidens walked along the Nile, she spied the basket amongst the reeds, sent a slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, saw it was a child, a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter. So picture Miriam's hiding in the reeds. She steps out into this clearing and says, "Shall I go get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child?" Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. This woman, by tradition, is Moses's mother, Yocheved. And when the child grew up, she, I think it's Miriam, brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. So she arranges for the nurse that will teach Moses his heritage, and she arranges for him to be adopted into the Pharaoh's house. Midrash on more that Miriam brings to the table. That first sentence, there was a man of the house of Levi who took a wife, for a wife, a daughter of Levi. The Gemara asks, to where did he go? He went according to the advice of his daughter Miriam. Amram, Moses' father, was the great man of his generation. Once he saw that wicked Pharaoh said, "Every son that's born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive," he said, "We are laboring for nothing," says Amram, "by bringing children into the world to be killed." Therefore, he arose and divorced his wife. All others who saw this followed his example and arose and divorced their wives. His daughter Miriam said to him, "Father, your decree is more harsh for the Jewish people than that of the Pharaoh. As Pharaoh decreed only with respect to the males, but you decreed both on the males and on the females. And now no children will be born. Additionally, Pharaoh decreed to kill them only in this world, but you decreed in the world to come." Miriam continued, "Additionally, concerning Pharaoh the wicked, it's uncertain whether his decree will be fulfilled. But you're a righteous person and your decrees will be fulfilled." And with that, Amram accepted his daughter's words, arose and brought back, i.e. remarried his wife, and all others who saw this followed his example and arose and brought back their wives. So Miriam, according to the Midrash, is this sort of prodigy who is able to talk her own father into reuniting with Yocheved and to allow the birth of Moses. Another thing, so this is the song of Moses at the Red Sea when Pharaoh and his charioteers drowned. And it's this long 19 verses. But the beginning, Az Yashir, then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song to God, saying, and this is kind of the key, Ashira ladonai ki ga'o ga'a sus v'rachvo v'rama v'yam. I will sing about the glory of God. The horses and their riders died in the sea. And it goes on. And then in verses 20 and 21, Miriam comes out with a hand drum. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, picked up a hand drum. All the women went after her and danced with hand drums. And Miriam chanted for them, "Sing to Adonai, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." And here it is. Vatan Miriam lahem shiru ladonai, sing to God ki go'o ga'a susvarachvo rama vayam. It's almost exactly Moses's first words. The only difference is Moses says Ashira, I will sing, and Miriam says Shiru. So what does Miriam do here? She makes it a song. She makes it a dance. And this is the culture of the people. They will learn of this event, not by Moses's 20-sentence long speech, but by Miriam's jingle, right? To go further, and this is an amazing one, Miriam, it says, Miriam the prophet. In Hebrew, Vatikach Miriam Haniviyah. And Chizkuni, a biblical commentator, says Miriam the prophetess. The word prophetess is used here to describe Miriam's extraordinary ability to use words to express her feelings. Isn't that an amazing midrash? And think about, does this midrash make you think about Miriam and her relationship to Moses? And what thought does it prompt to say Miriam's extraordinary ability to use words to express her feelings? Thoughts on that, Fallon?
I actually read this piece by Rabbi Daniel Rittenberg, which posits the idea that Miriam's like the one who started the song, and later the text was rearranged a little bit to make it seem as if Moses had started it to give him a larger role in the story. I don't have the link for that post right now, but I found the Twitter thread where she started talking about it before she wrote the blog post.
Yep.
Which I just think is a fascinating idea.
That is fascinating, that Miriam was first to the party with this, and Moses actually was a secondary role. I love that. But what about this notion of, and thank you for sharing that, and if you can maybe share the link with the group after, because sometimes it can be hard to find it, that would be great. But what about this notion of her facility with words? Does it make you, I mean, there's a contrast with Moses, right? Moses is the one who's heavy of tongue, right? And you can just imagine that in the family circle growing up, Miriam had something that Moses didn't have, that facility with words and that ability to connect. Annette.
Well, I feel, whoops, sorry, I almost spilled something. I feel like her facility with words is what got her to convince the Pharaoh's daughter all these arrangements that she made. I mean, here's this Jewish girl who comes from not much, convincing the Pharaoh's daughter about how to get someone to nurse the baby, take care of the baby, to give up the baby. I feel like she saved his life.
Yes.
Here's this Jewish kid in a basket. So the Pharaoh's daughter finds the kid in the basket. She says, oh, it must be a Jewish boy, she's a genius. But how is the Pharaoh's daughter gonna take care of this Jewish baby and hide it from her father? Miriam figures it all out for her and convinces her how to do it.
Right.
Well, obviously you have to have some gift of language and persuasion to do that.
Yes, as a 10-year-old.
Yeah, so I think she had some facility with language, and I think she saved her brother's life.
Yes, very, very true. Allowed him to be born, and then once born, saved his life.
Right, both.
Fallon.
I was just gonna say, it feels like Miriam is facilitating everything that makes this possible, behind the scenes. Allowing Moses to be born and then arranging for the wet nurse room and everything. And then, later in the desert, providing the well that allows everyone to drink. Moses is doing the very front-facing things, talking to God and leading them through the desert and everything, but without Miriam, he wouldn't be there. And then the people wouldn't be able to survive the wandering in the desert without her well. She's doing a lot of the maybe not as flashy things, those things that aren't as front facing, but that are vital to the survival of this people.
Yes, well, that's a very good point. And I'll just, mindful of the time, I'll just pivot us to this whole emotional labor thing. I don't know if you had a chance to read the article, but about women being the architects of the household and keeping everything going and making the pediatrician appointments and everything else. The question, I don't know if you buy it, but the paradigm of Miriam was that behind the scenes architect that kept everything running. Is there, there's a sense in which maybe Moses is grief stricken and can't speak, and all he can do is lash out because he's not in touch with his grief. So there is that. There's another interpretation of potentially, did this woman go unrecognized for her gift? And that was what was behind the lack of mourning. There's a wonderful, the Torah, a woman's commentary, has an amazing drash, and I just want to share that. So there's two wonderful texts here. One being, let me find this here, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. So the details are in truth, so this goes exactly to Annette's point. So the details are in truth secondary to the human drama played out that day. Yes, Moses did things he might not have done, should not have done. He struck the rock. He said we instead of God, lost his temper. The real story, though, is about Moses, the human being, in an onslaught of grief, vulnerable, exposed, caught in a vortex of emotions, suddenly bereft of the sisterly presence that had been the most important bass note of his life. Miriam had been the precociously wise and plucky child who had taken control of the situation when the life of her 3-month-old brother lay in the balance, undaunted by either an Egyptian princess or a rabbi father. She had led the Israelite women in song and sympathized with her sister-in-law. So there's a whole nother text that we don't have time to unpack, when she saw the price she paid for being the wife of a leader. The Midrash speaks of her as the woman in whose merit the people had water in a parched land. In Moses' anguish at the rock, we sense the loss of the elder sister without whom he felt bereft and alone. The story of the moment Moses lost his confidence and calm is ultimately less about leadership in crisis or about a staff and a rock than about a great Jewish woman, Miriam, appreciated fully only when she was no longer there. One more thing. So this is from the women's commentary. Talking about how Moses does not record Moses's reaction, the text does not record his reaction, but so let me find this here. So the telling clue, let me see if I can find this. Going back up to those two verses. I'm sorry. No. Okay, here it is. Going back to the incident of striking the rock, right? And in that first sentence, 10, Vayakilu Moshe, I'm running through the first line, Vayomer Lahem Shim'una, listen, Hamorim, you rebels. And the women's commentary from the Women's Commentary Bible, Morim is the same letters as Miriam. So you rebels, he had Miriam on the mind. The other point made by that commentary is that I, in presenting this to you, gave the second death, Aaron's death, first. But what happened was Miriam died first, and there was no mourning for Miriam. And this commentary says Moses learned his lesson from his failure to properly mourn Miriam. And when it became Aaron's turn, he knew how to do it right, which I thought was a beautiful commentary. Anyway, it is interesting, this whole notion about the women arranged the babysitting. Miriam did arrange Moses's babysitting, for what it's worth. So I wanted to take us at the end here. I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to start sharing on a different document. So that, let me see if I can find it here. And this is that Philip Larkin poem that I, let's see. Let me go back here. I don't know if people had a chance to read it, but it is a lovely poem. I'm just going to read it here. So Philip Larkin, The trees. The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. Is it that they are born again as we grow old? No, they die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. Yet still the unresting castles thresh in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. So this notion of annual renewal is very beautifully captured in the metaphor of trees that go through their cycle of living and dying. So I guess, you know, in closing, I guess the wish is that we all can approach our harsh passages with the renewal resilience that some perspective can give, and that we all have the capacity to be able to do that. The last thing, by serendipity, I received a clip that I think has gone viral, which is Joni Mitchell at the Newport Folk Festival. Have people seen that? Of her singing both sides now?
Yes.
Yeah,
I
I cried totally. Looking at Winona Judd weeping in the background had me going. But this has anyone not seen it? I will share the link. I'll share it. It's an amazing example of going back to something that you've heard over and over again, and yet you derive new layers of meaning hearing it again. I just thought it was a beautiful illustration of why we come back over and over again to, you know, these holidays, and these insights just go ever deeper.
Rich, you might want to tell everybody what happened to Joni Mitchell in case people, does everybody know what happened to Joni Mitchell in her life?
Do you want to tell us about it?
I don't know how many years ago it was. Joni Mitchell had
9 years. It was 9 years.
9
I
years
think it was
ago,
9 years ago.
had a brain aneurysm, which she survived, but she had to learn how to do everything again, to walk, to talk, to eat, I mean, everything like a baby. And she can now sing and play the guitar. And she sang and played the guitar. I'm going to start crying.
Oh,
Festival. Sorry, I'm going to start crying. Anybody else who saw it Wednesday, I think she had to start her life over.
wow.
After having a brain aneurysm.
Wow. I feel like I heard those words like I'd never heard them before. And
Yeah.
she's saying them more slowly.
She sang both sides now.
Yeah.
And she also, if I could just interject that, that's the audition. If I haven't seen all of Coda that got the best Oscar.
Oh, yes.
But that is what the girl sang that song, and she was over the moon that Joni Mitchell had said publicly how much she liked it. And I cried when I saw that too.
Yes.
It made me cry. I think Judy Collins recorded it first. I'm not sure.
Yes. Judy Collins recorded it with that kind of like electronic synthesizer.
Right. Yeah.
Bouncy,
It's nothing close. But what amazed me was it's perfectly fine that she was singing from a lower register.
right.
It still sounded beautiful. And there was that and Summertime, those two in particular, in which her voice did not crack.
Yeah.
And just to evolve and to accept and to still have grit and work as hard as she did.
She's 78 years old. She's 78
Crazy.
years old. So
Yeah. But that version from Coda that you're referencing, Nomi, is totally stunning. That was Yes,
It's a work of art.
yeah,
And, oh, Susanna's saying, and she taught herself to play guitar all over again.
yeah. Oh, my
It's
God.
astonishing.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, everyone, thank you for joining tonight. Really appreciate that. It's good to see everybody, and thank you for all of the wonderful comments, insights, and conversation.
We're gonna have
Thank you,
Joni. I thought you were gonna show us
Thank you,
Joni.
Rich.
Thank you for all your work, Rich. Rich, do you have another minute?
I do.
Okay, can you stay on? I want to ask you something.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Happy
Bye,
to.
everybody.
Okay.
Erev Tov.
Bye-bye. Well.
Love everyone. Annette, would you like everyone else to drop off for this?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, here we are. Yes. And
Everybody
let me
else.
stop recording as well.
Okay.
Let me see how do I do that?